The lawyer's hands trembled as he opened the sealed envelope, and when he read my late husband's final words aloud, my daughter-in-law's face went white as marble. "You conniving old witch. You manipulated him into changing everything behind our backs." I sat frozen in that leather chair, my wedding ring catching the dim office light, unable to speak as 23 years of fake smiles finally cracked. "I'm so grateful you found my story today. If this reaches you, please stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button if you've ever felt invisible in your own family. Subscribe so we can walk this path together, and tell me in the comments what country you're watching from. I need to know. My voice is traveling beyond these walls." My name is Eleanor Margaret Hayes. I'm 71 years old, and I'm sitting in the law office where my world just flipped upside down. For 45 years, I thought I knew my husband Thomas. I thought I knew my son Richard. I thought I knew the woman he married. But that afternoon, surrounded by mahogany bookshelves and the scent of old paper, I learned that the people closest to us can be the most dangerous strangers of all. Thomas had been gone 3 weeks. 3 weeks of casseroles from neighbors, condolence cards, and Sandra's theatrical tears at the funeral. She'd worn black designer clothes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief while whispering to everyone about how worried she was about my mental state. The attorney, Mr. Brennan, had known Thomas for 30 years. His weathered face looked troubled as he shuffled through documents on his massive oak desk. Richard sat beside Sandra, both of them leaning forward like vultures waiting for roadkill. "Now, Mrs. Hayes," Mr. Brennan began, "your husband left very specific instructions about how this should be handled. I expected the usual routine. The house divided somehow. The savings split between Richard and me. Maybe some special mention of Thomas's tools going to his son. Instead, Mr. Brennan pulled out that envelope. My name written in Thomas's careful script across the front, the paper thick and expensive, like something important. He wanted me to read this aloud, in front of everyone. Sandra's manicured fingers drummed against her purse. Richard shifted uncomfortably, loosening his tie. Something cold settled in my stomach. Mr. Brennan's voice cracked as he began. "Eleanor, if you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and you're surrounded by people who've been lying to you for years." The room went silent, except for the old clock, ticking on the wall. "Richard and Sandra have been stealing from us. From you. I have proof of everything. Bank records, recordings, photographs. They thought I was too old and too trusting to notice. They were wrong." Sandra shot up from her chair like she'd been electrocuted. Her perfect composure shattered completely. "This is insane. He was losing his mind those last months. Everyone knows that." But Mr. Brennan kept reading. "I've moved all our assets into Eleanor's name alone. The house, the savings, the investments, everything. She deserves to know the truth about who she's been feeding Sunday dinners to." Richard's face went pale. "Dad wouldn't, he always said I'd inherit, because you told him I was getting senile," I whispered, finding my voice at last. "Because Sandra convinced you I couldn't handle money." Sandra spun toward me, her mask finally gone. "You think you're so innocent? You wrapped that old man around your finger for decades." "I wrapped bandages around his construction wounds," I said quietly. "I wrapped Christmas presents for grandchildren you barely let me see. I wrapped my whole life around loving both of you." Mr. Brennan cleared his throat. "There's more, Mrs. Hayes, much more. I met Thomas when I was 26, working the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital. He came in with a dislocated shoulder from a construction accident, cursing like a sailor, but thanking every nurse who helped him. His hard hat sat crooked on his dark hair, and concrete dust covered his work boots. "Sorry for the language, ma'am," he'd said to me, wincing as I adjusted his sling. "My mama raised me better." I fell in love with his calloused hands and gentle heart. He built our first house with those hands, every board and nail placed with care. I gave up nursing to support his growing business, keeping books and answering phones from our kitchen table, while he turned his small crew into the most trusted construction company in 3 counties. Richard came 2 years after we married. Thomas cried when he held his son for the first time, promising to give him everything he never had growing up. Maybe that was our mistake. We gave Richard everything except the understanding that gifts should be earned. By the time Richard turned 16, He expected new cars and designer clothes. When Thomas suggested summer work with the construction crew, Richard sneered. "I'm not getting my hands dirty like some common laborer." Thomas's face went hard that day. "There's nothing common about honest work, son." But Richard had already learned that tears and manipulation worked better than effort. He'd apologize, just enough to get what he wanted, then repeat the same patterns. Thomas and I made excuses, hoping maturity would fix what we'd broken with too much generosity. Then Sandra arrived. She was 32 when she met our 35-year-old son at some corporate networking event. Polished, ambitious, with a smile that never quite reached her calculating eyes. She worked in real estate and dressed like money, even though we later learned she was drowning in debt. At their first family dinner, she surveyed our house like an appraiser. "What a charming vintage kitchen," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "So authentic." Thomas squeezed my hand under the table. He saw through her immediately, but Richard was smitten. Within 6 months they were engaged. Within a year, married in a ceremony that cost more than most people's cars. I should have spoken up when Sandra started her subtle campaign. Little comments about how Richard needed to focus on his own future. Suggestions that we were too involved in their lives. Questions about our financial planning that felt more like inventory assessments. "Richard's father works so hard," she'd say during visits. "It would be terrible if something happened and Eleanor couldn't manage everything alone." She planted seeds of doubt about my capabilities while positioning herself as the caring daughter-in-law, just looking out for family. Richard, desperate to please his beautiful wife, began seeing me through her critical lens. Dinners became shorter. Visits more strategic. Phone calls focused on what they needed, rather than how we were doing. When I tried talking to Thomas about the changes, he'd pat my hand and say, "Give them time, Eleanor. Marriage is an adjustment." But I watched him grow quieter during their visits. Watched him study Sandra when she thought no one was looking. Watched him start locking his desk drawer and taking phone calls in the garage. Those last months, he'd disappear for hours, claiming errands that should have taken minutes. He installed new locks on his office door and bought a small safe I wasn't supposed to know about. When I asked questions, he'd kiss my forehead and promise we'd talk soon. I thought he was planning some surprise, maybe a vacation or a special gift for our upcoming anniversary. I never imagined he was planning to save my life. Sandra entered our family like a slow poison, sweet and barely noticeable until the damage was done. She'd been married twice before Richard, both relationships ending in bitter financial disputes that somehow left her former husbands bankrupt while she moved on to bigger opportunities. But I didn't know any of this when she first walked into our Sunday dinners. 8 years ago, all smiles and perfectly applied lipstick. "Mrs. Hayes, this roast is absolutely divine," she'd gush while barely touching her food. "You simply must share the recipe." She never actually wanted the recipes. She just wanted to appear interested while cataloging every piece of furniture, every family photo, every hint of our financial situation. Her compliments always came with tiny barbs. "This china pattern is so classic, very traditional." "What a substantial house. Much larger than Richard and I need, of course. You've accumulated so many lovely things over the years. It must be overwhelming to maintain." She convinced Richard that my housekeeping was declining, that I seemed confused about dates and appointments. She suggested I was becoming too attached to material possessions, that downsizing might be healthy for someone my age. "Your mother is so sweet," she'd tell Richard within my hearing, "but she's getting clingy. It's normal for older women to become more dependent." Richard, who'd been pulling away from us for years, suddenly felt justified in his distance. Sandra's observations confirmed what he wanted to believe, that his parents were becoming burdens rather than people who'd sacrificed everything for his comfort. She isolated us methodically. Family gatherings moved to restaurants where she controlled the conversation. Holiday celebrations happened at their house, where I was treated like an elderly guest rather than Richard's mother. She scheduled their social events to conflict with our traditions, then acted disappointed when Richard chose her calendar over ours. "I hope your parents understand," she'd say with fake concern. "We have so many obligations." The manipulation reached its peak during our last Christmas dinner together. Sandra arrived in a white cashmere coat that probably cost more than my winter heating bill, carrying expensive wine and store-bought desserts. "I brought these little tarts from that French bakery," she announced, setting them beside my homemade apple pie. "I thought we should have something a bit more sophisticated." She critiqued everything with surgical precision. My decorations were cluttered. My cooking was heavy. My stories about Richard's childhood were embarrassing him. "Richard's told me how you used to dress him up for school pictures," she laughed, showing photos on her phone. Such creative choices. Richard joined her laughter instead of defending the mother who'd sewn his Halloween costumes by hand and packed love notes in his lunchboxes. My heart cracked watching my grown son side with this woman against memories we'd made together. "Maybe it's time to simplify," Sandra suggested, gesturing around our house. "All these old photos and knickknacks must be exhausting to dust." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Eleanor's collections tell the story of our life together." "Of course," Sandra smiled. "But at some point, don't you want freedom from so much responsibility?" That night, after they left, I found Thomas standing in his office doorway, staring at his locked desk. "She wants us gone," I whispered. "I know," he said quietly, "but she doesn't know who she's dealing with." Everything accelerated after Thomas's first heart attack, 2 years ago. The emergency room, the bypass surgery, the long recovery that left him weaker, but somehow more determined. Sandra and Richard visited constantly during those weeks, but their concern felt calculated rather than genuine. They brought flowers and get-well cards, but their conversations always circled back to our plans. What would happen if Thomas couldn't work anymore? Had we considered assisted living? Wouldn't it be wise to simplify our financial responsibilities? "Dad, you've worked so hard all your life," Richard would say, holding his father's hand in the hospital bed. "Maybe it's time to let someone else handle the heavy decisions." Sandra nodded sympathetically. "Eleanor's been under such stress. Managing everything alone would be impossible if something happened to you, Thomas." They painted pictures of my helplessness, while I sat right there invisible in my own crisis. They discussed my limitations, like I was a child who couldn't understand adult conversations. They planned my future without asking what I might want. During Thomas's recovery, they took over small responsibilities that grew larger each week. Richard started handling some business paperwork. Sandra organized my medical appointments and grocery shopping. They presented these helps as loving support while positioning themselves deeper into our lives. "Your mother seems so scattered lately," Sandra would tell Richard during their kitchen conferences. "Yesterday she couldn't remember which pharmacy she uses." I remembered perfectly. I'd been going to the same pharmacy for 20 years, but Sandra was building a narrative of my declining mental capacity, supported by Richard's willingness to believe the worst about the woman who'd raised him. They brought real estate brochures for active senior communities and left them on our coffee table. They researched smaller apartments and condos, claiming they wanted us to have less maintenance stress. They calculated property values and discussed our neighborhood's potential with the enthusiasm of carrion birds. "This house is really too much for 2 people," Sandra would say, running her fingers along our mantelpiece, "and Eleanor rattling around here alone someday. It's just not practical." Thomas recovered slowly, but something in his eyes had sharpened during those bedridden weeks. He watched Richard and Sandra with new attention, asking questions that seemed casual but weren't. "How's your work going, Sandra? Real estate must be challenging right now." "Richard, remind me about that investment opportunity you mentioned last month." "Eleanor, did you happen to notice anything unusual about the bank statements?" I hadn't been paying attention to finances. Thomas had always handled money while I managed our home and his business office, but his questions made me start noticing things. Conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, papers that disappeared from his desk, phone calls taken in the garage or basement. Sandra's suggestions became more insistent. Perhaps Thomas needed help managing investments. Maybe Richard should be added to bank accounts for emergency access. Wouldn't it be smart to put the house in Richard's name to avoid future tax complications? "We're just thinking ahead," she'd say with that practiced smile. "Family should look out for each other." But her version of looking out felt more like taking over. She researched our insurance policies and retirement accounts. She asked detailed questions about Thomas's business assets. She volunteered to help organize our important documents, The breaking point came 6 months before Thomas died. I was washing dishes after another tense Sunday dinner when I heard Sandra on the phone in our living room. "The old man's definitely slipping," she whispered. "And Eleanor's completely lost without him making decisions. We need to move faster before they do something stupid with all that money." My hands stopped moving in the soapy water. Through the kitchen window, I could see Thomas in his workshop, sorting through tools with unusual care. That night, he started locking doors I'd never seen locked before: his office, his workshop, even our bedroom safe that had sat open for decades. "Thomas, what's wrong?" He kissed my forehead like always, but his eyes looked different, distant, strategic. "Just organizing some things, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." But I was worried about the vultures circling our nest, about the son who'd stopped seeing me as a person, about the husband who was preparing for something he couldn't tell me about. Thomas had always said vultures circle before the kill. I just didn't know he was preparing to fight back. The afternoon Thomas died, Sandra was going through his desk before the paramedics even left our house. I was too shocked to think clearly. Still holding his coffee cup and staring at the empty chair where he'd been reading his morning paper just hours before. "Eleanor, honey, you shouldn't have to deal with paperwork right now," she said, pulling folders from his locked drawers with keys. I didn't know she had. "Let me organize Thomas's important documents." She worked with practiced efficiency, separating papers into piles while I stood frozen in my grief. Richard held my shoulders, but even his comfort felt mechanical, like he was following a script Sandra had written. "Mom, Sandra's right. You shouldn't stress about business details today." They took control of everything immediately. Phone calls to the funeral home, meetings with insurance agents, discussions about practical matters that couldn't wait. I drifted through those first days like a ghost in my own life, trusting them to handle arrangements while I tried to process losing my husband of 45 years. But even through my grief, I noticed things. Sandra photographing documents before filing them away. Richard asking detailed questions about Thomas's safe combinations and account passwords, both of them treating our house like they already owned it. "We'll need to go through everything systematically," Sandra announced the morning after the funeral. Thomas was so meticulous about keeping records, but Eleanor shouldn't be burdened with all these details. She'd brought boxes and file folders, ready to organize our entire life into categories she could understand and control. I sat at my kitchen table, still wearing my funeral dress, watching this woman catalog my marriage like a business acquisition. "Eleanor, dear, do you remember where Thomas kept his investment statements?" she asked, her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes calculating. "Richard and I want to make sure nothing important gets overlooked." I shook my head, genuinely confused. Thomas had always managed our finances privately, showing me monthly household budgets, but handling the larger financial picture himself. I knew we were comfortable, but I'd never paid attention to specifics. "That's okay," Sandra smiled. "We'll figure it out. The important thing is protecting you from having to deal with complicated money matters." She spoke about me like I was a child who needed protection from sharp corners and complicated concepts. Richard nodded along, convinced that his wife's take-charge attitude was exactly what his helpless mother needed. But Thomas's lawyer had insisted on meeting within a week of the funeral. Standard procedure, Mr. Brennan had explained over the phone. Thomas left very specific instructions about timing. That meeting felt like walking into an ambush I hadn't seen coming. Mr. Brennan's office smelled like leather and old wood, lined with law books that had probably witnessed 1,000 family dramas. Sandra and Richard flanked me like bodyguards. Sandra's designer handbag placed strategically on the table beside a stack of papers she'd brought. "Mrs. Hayes," Mr. Brennan began carefully, "your husband was very thorough in his final preparations. He wanted to ensure you were protected and informed about everything." Sandra leaned forward eagerly. "Thomas was such a planner. We've been helping Eleanor organize his papers, and there are quite a few financial decisions that need attention." "Actually," Mr. Brennan said quietly, "Thomas anticipated that, which is why he left these instructions." He pulled out that envelope with my name written in Thomas's careful script. Heavy paper, sealed with wax like something from another century. My heart squeezed seeing his handwriting. still missing him so desperately that even his penmanship could make me cry. He was very specific about this being read aloud, with everyone present. Sandra's confidence flickered for just a moment. Of course, we're all family here. But as Mr. Brennan began reading Thomas's words, the temperature in that room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Each sentence hit like a physical blow, revealing truths I'd been too trusting to see and betrayals I'd been too naive to imagine. My husband's voice reached me from beyond death, telling me exactly who had been lying to my face for years. And Sandra's mask, finally, completely shattered. I drove home from the lawyer's office in silence, my hands shaking on the steering wheel as Thomas's revelations echoed in my mind. Sandra and Richard had stormed out after her screaming fit, but not before Sandra hissed threats about contesting everything and proving I was mentally incompetent. The house felt different when I walked through the front door. Every room held memories of their visits, their conversations, their careful observations about what would need to be simplified someday. Now I understood they'd been conducting inventory assessments while I served them coffee and homemade cookies. I found them waiting in my kitchen. Moving boxes stacked by the back door. Real estate brochures spread across my table. Sandra's laptop open to listings for senior living communities. They'd let themselves in with keys I'd given them, for emergencies, ready to pack up my life before Thomas was even cold in his grave. "Eleanor, we need to talk," Richard said, his voice strained but determined. "This whole situation is impossible." Sandra stood beside him, her earlier hysteria replaced by cold calculation. She'd changed from her funeral outfit into jeans and a work shirt, dressed for the physical labor of dismantling my existence. "That will was written when Thomas wasn't thinking clearly," she announced. "Anyone can see he was manipulated into making irrational decisions." I stared at the boxes, at the brochures, at their presumptuous invasion of my grief. "You brought moving supplies to my house on the day of my husband's funeral. We're trying to help you face reality," Sandra snapped. "This house is too much responsibility for someone your age. These financial assets are too complicated for you to manage alone." I managed Thomas's business books for 20 years. "That was different," Richard said quickly. "This is serious money, Mom. Investment portfolios, property holdings, retirement accounts. You don't understand how complex." "I understand that my husband spent his final months protecting me from thieves." The word hung in the air like a slap. Sandra's face flushed red, but her voice stayed controlled. "Thomas was sick, Eleanor. Paranoid. Seeing enemies where there were only people who loved him. People who stole nearly $200,000 from joint accounts." Richard went pale. "That's impossible. We never—" "Bank records don't lie, son. Neither do security cameras." I pulled out my phone and showed them the text message Mr. Brennan had sent after they stormed out of his office. A photo of a bank statement showing unauthorized transfers to accounts in Sandra's name. Another photo of her using Thomas's debit card at an ATM 3 states away. Sandra's mask slipped completely. "You senile old bitch. You think you can destroy my marriage with fake evidence? I think my dead husband documented everything you did to us." She lunged toward me, but Richard caught her arm. For a moment I saw something in my son's eyes that looked like the boy I'd raised: confusion. Horror. The dawning realization that he'd chosen the wrong side in a war he didn't even know was being fought. "Sandra, what is she talking about?" "She's lying. Thomas was losing his mind, and she's manipulating his paranoid fantasies to steal what should be ours." But Richard was staring at the phone in my hand, reading the bank statements Mr. Brennan had forwarded. Account numbers he recognized. Transactions he might have helped authorize. His face crumbled as understanding hit him. "Oh God, Sandra, what did you do?" "I protected our future. Your parents were going to waste everything on medical bills and nursing homes. I saved what should have been yours anyway." "By stealing from my dying father?" The fight drained out of Richard's voice, replaced by something that sounded like the grief I should have seen at Thomas's funeral. But Sandra wasn't finished. "Your father hoarded money while we struggled with our mortgage. Your mother played helpless while sitting on a fortune. I just moved assets to where they'd be used properly. Those assets bought your designer clothes," I said quietly. "Your expensive dinners, your spa weekends. While I clipped coupons, and Thomas wore work boots with holes. Richard sank into my kitchen chair, staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before. You told me they were selfish with money. You said they could afford to help us but chose not to. They could, but they preferred controlling you through guilt and manipulation. They preferred paying their own bills and saving for retirement. I watched my son's marriage dissolve in real time as he finally saw Sandra clearly. But it was too late for forgiveness. Too late for family redemption. The damage was done, and Thomas's death had simply revealed the rot that was already there. Sandra grabbed her laptop and purse, her face twisted with rage. This isn't over, Eleanor. I know lawyers too, and I know how to prove an elderly woman isn't mentally competent to manage complex financial decisions. You know how to forge signatures, I replied calmly. But Mr. Brennan knows how to prosecute fraud. She slammed my door so hard the windows rattled. Richard sat at my table, his head in his hands, surrounded by the boxes they'd brought to pack up my life. Mom, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. But he had known. Maybe not the details, but he'd known something was wrong and chosen not to question it. He'd known his wife's spending habits didn't match their income. He'd known her suggestions about my mental decline were convenient rather than medical. He'd known and he'd chosen her lies over his parents' truth. Thomas had left me more than financial security. He'd left me clarity about who deserved my trust and who had already broken it beyond repair. Now I had to decide what to do with that terrible gift. The detective Thomas had hired was a quiet woman named Sarah Chen, who looked like she could disappear into any crowd. She sat in my living room the next morning, spreading photographs and documents across my coffee table, like evidence in a murder trial. Your husband was very thorough, she said, her voice matter-of-fact but kind. He suspected financial irregularities for about 8 months before he contacted me. The photos were devastating. Sandra using Thomas's credit card at luxury boutiques, Richard co-signing loans against property he didn't own, bank statements showing systematic transfers from accounts Thomas thought were secure. They created a narrative about your declining mental capacity, Detective Chen explained. Sandra told bank representatives you were showing signs of dementia and that she needed access to help manage your affairs. But I never showed any such signs. Exactly. Your husband recorded several conversations where Sandra coached Richard on what to say to financial institutions. She was building a legal framework to take control of everything after Thomas died. The recordings were worse than the photographs. My son's voice, uncertain but compliant, repeating Sandra's lies to loan officers and account managers. Sandra's voice, confident and manipulative, explaining how worried she was about her elderly in-law's capacity to make good decisions. The good news, Detective Chen continued, is that your husband documented everything meticulously. The bad news is that they're not going to give up easily. She was right. Over the next 3 days, Sandra launched a coordinated attack on my reputation and competence. She called my doctor's office, claiming I'd seemed confused during recent visits. She contacted neighbors with concerns about my ability to maintain the house safely. She even called Adult Protective Services with reports about my declining self-care. Each phone call was designed to build a paper trail of my supposed incompetence. She was creating evidence to support a legal challenge to Thomas's will and my mental capacity to inherit everything. But Thomas had anticipated this too. Detective Chen showed me security footage from cameras I'd never noticed. Sandra searching through Thomas's desk drawers when she thought we weren't watching. Sandra photographing financial documents during family dinners. Sandra having whispered conversations with Richard about property values and inheritance timelines. She made 2 critical mistakes, Detective Chen explained. First, she underestimated your husband's awareness. Second, she got greedy toward the end. The greed showed in bank records, spanning 2 years. Small transfers, at first easily overlooked or explained away. But as Thomas's health declined, the amounts grew larger and more frequent. Credit cards opened in Thomas's name. Loans secured against our property. Investment accounts liquidated without authorization. The total theft exceeds $190,000, Detective Chen said. That elevates this from simple fraud to grand larceny. She handed me a folder containing everything Thomas had gathered: financial records, security footage, recorded conversations, witness statements from bank employees who remembered Sandra's visits. Evidence that painted a clear picture of systematic elder abuse disguised as family concern. Your husband left you a choice, Mrs. Hayes. You can pursue criminal charges, civil recovery, or both. You can handle this privately through attorneys, or you can let law enforcement take the lead. I thought about Thomas's final letter, his words about protecting me and giving me options. He'd known I would need time to process everything, to decide how much justice I could live with, and how much revenge would poison my remaining years. What would you do? I asked Detective Chen. She smiled grimly. I'd make sure they never had the opportunity to do this to another family. That afternoon, Sandra's attorney sent a formal letter demanding I rectify the inheritance mistake and threatening to pursue guardianship proceedings. If I didn't comply, the letter accused me of manipulating a sick man and questioned my mental fitness to manage complex financial affairs. I read the letter twice, then called Detective Chen. I want to pursue every available legal remedy. I told her: criminal charges, civil recovery, and public exposure. My husband spent his final months protecting me. The least I can do is protect other families from going through this. Are you sure, Mrs. Hayes? This will get ugly. They'll attack your character, your mental capacity, your marriage. They'll make you relive every painful moment of this betrayal. I looked around my house, at the rooms where Sandra had cataloged my possessions, and Richard had calculated inheritance values. At the kitchen table, where they'd planned my future without consulting me. At the front door they'd walked through with moving boxes before Thomas was even buried. Let them try, I said quietly. I've got truth on my side, and apparently that's a very powerful weapon. Detective Chen's smile was sharp as winter wind. Then let's give them a war they'll never forget. Sandra's desperation became obvious when she started calling old friends and distant relatives, spinning elaborate stories about my supposed mental decline and Thomas's suspicious final decisions. She painted herself as a concerned daughter-in-law, trying to protect the family from my poor judgment and emotional instability. But Sandra had underestimated small-town networks and overestimated her own charm. My neighbor Margaret called first. Eleanor, dear, I had the strangest conversation with Sandra yesterday. She seemed to think you were having memory problems, but you just balanced your checkbook perfectly at the bank last week. Then my sister Ruth called from Arizona. Some woman named Sandra contacted me about your deteriorating condition. She wanted to know if our family had any history of dementia. I told her the only deteriorating thing around here was her credibility. Sandra was conducting a whisper campaign, but the whispers were reaching the wrong ears and getting the wrong reception. Our community had watched me care for Thomas through his illness, manage his business affairs, and handle the funeral arrangements with complete competence. Her claims about my mental decline rang false to people who interacted with me regularly. Meanwhile, I was conducting my own quiet campaign. I scheduled lunch with Patricia Morrison, whose late husband had been Thomas's business partner for 15 years. Patricia knew our financial situation better than most people and had always suspected Sandra's expensive lifestyle didn't match Richard's modest salary. I never wanted to say anything while Thomas was alive. Patricia confided over coffee, but Sandra asked me some very inappropriate questions about your business accounts. She seemed to know details about your finances that seemed concerning. I shared some of Detective Chen's findings with Patricia, who immediately connected me with 2 other families who'd experienced similar manipulation from adult children and their spouses. The pattern was depressingly familiar: gradual isolation, financial control, and systematic undermining of the elderly parent's competence and independence. One woman, Martha Hendricks, had lost nearly her entire savings to a daughter-in-law who'd convinced everyone that Martha's late husband had promised the money to fund their children's college education. Another family had discovered forged documents and unauthorized loans only after the father died and left behind meticulous records of the theft. They prey on our generation's tendency to trust family and avoid conflict, Martha explained. They use our love for our children against us. These conversations strengthened my resolve, but also revealed how sophisticated Sandra's manipulation had become. She'd researched successful financial abuse cases and adapted their strategies to our specific situation. Her performance wasn't improvised desperation, it was calculated predation. Detective Chen confirmed this when she uncovered Sandra's internet search history from Thomas's computer, which Sandra had been using during her visits to our house. She researched elder abuse legislation, inheritance law, and mental competency standards, Detective Chen reported. She also looked up several assisted living facilities and calculated property values for houses in your neighborhood. The search history painted a chilling picture of premeditation. Sandra hadn't stumbled into financial abuse. She'd planned it systematically, researching legal vulnerabilities and preparing for multiple scenarios depending on how long Thomas lived and how aware he became of her activities. But her research had missed one critical factor: Thomas's own investigation skills and his decision to fight back rather than quietly accept victimization. The trap was nearly set. All I needed now was the right moment to spring it. Sandra provided that moment herself when she called to propose a family meeting to resolve our misunderstanding before things got unnecessarily complicated. "Eleanor, I think we can work something out that's fair to everyone," she said, her voice artificially sweet. "Richard feels terrible about the tension between us. Maybe we could meet somewhere neutral and find a reasonable compromise." She suggested the country club, where she'd been bragging about their expected inheritance for months. The same place where she'd told friends that Thomas was losing his grip, and I was completely overwhelmed by financial responsibilities. "That sounds reasonable," I agreed. "When would be good for you?" "How about Richard's birthday next week? We could make it a celebration and a fresh start." "Perfect." Sandra wanted to resolve our misunderstanding in front of the same social circle she'd been lying to for months. She was so confident in her narrative and so certain of my weakness that she was walking directly into the trap Thomas had designed. Detective Chen smiled when I told her about Sandra's proposal. She wants to negotiate from a position of strength, surrounded by witnesses who'll support her version of events. "Then let's give her witnesses," I said. "Just not the kind she's expecting." Richard's birthday party was going to be very educational for everyone involved. The country club's private dining room buzzed with conversations about golf scores and vacation plans, exactly the kind of genteel atmosphere Sandra used to establish her credibility. She'd invited 20 people to Richard's birthday celebration, creating an audience for what she assumed would be my public capitulation to her demands. I arrived precisely on time, wearing my best dress and carrying a leather portfolio that Detective Chen had helped me organize. Sandra greeted me with theatrical warmth, air-kissing my cheeks while positioning herself as the gracious hostess managing a difficult family situation. "Everyone, you remember Richard's mother, Eleanor," she announced to the gathered friends and business associates. "She's been going through such a hard time since Thomas passed." The undertone was clear to everyone present. Poor elderly woman, struggling with grief and confusion, needs patient management from her competent daughter-in-law. Several people nodded sympathetically, probably remembering Sandra's previous comments about my declining capabilities. Richard looked uncomfortable but resigned, like a man who'd accepted his wife's version of reality rather than examine the evidence himself. He kissed my cheek dutifully, but avoided meeting my eyes. "Mom, I'm glad you came." Sandra thought this would be a good opportunity to talk through some things. "I think talking is an excellent idea," I agreed, settling into the chair they'd arranged for me at the head of the table. "I brought some things to share, too." Detective Chen entered the dining room, as if she'd simply arrived for lunch, nodding politely to the other guests before taking a seat near the back. Most people didn't notice her, but Sandra's eyes narrowed slightly. Something about the woman's presence felt wrong to her, though she couldn't identify why. Mr. Brennan arrived next, followed by Patricia Morrison and two other friends, whose presence clearly puzzled Sandra. This was supposed to be her show, her audience, her narrative, but the cast was expanding beyond her control. "Eleanor," Sandra began, her voice warm but with steel underneath. "Richard and I have been thinking about how to handle this inheritance situation in a way that honors Thomas's memory while being practical about everyone's needs." She was performing for the audience, positioning herself as the reasonable problem solver dealing with an unreasonable old woman. Several guests nodded approvingly, admiring her patience with difficult in-laws. We think there might have been some confusion about Thomas's final wishes, she continued. Grief can make people see things that aren't really there, especially when legal documents seem to contradict years of family understanding. What kind of contradictions? I asked innocently. Sandra smiled confidently. Well, for instance, Thomas always promised Richard would inherit the family business and property. But these new documents suggest he changed everything without discussing it with anyone. That seems unlike the Thomas we all knew. Murmurs of agreement from guests who remembered Sandra's previous stories about her in-laws' financial planning. She'd been building this narrative for months, preparing these witnesses to support her version of events. You're absolutely right, I said, opening my portfolio. It would be very unlike Thomas to make major financial decisions without documenting his reasons thoroughly. I pulled out the first folder Detective Chen had prepared, which is why he left such detailed explanations for his choices. Sandra's confidence flickered as I began reading from Thomas's written account of discovering unauthorized withdrawals, forged signatures, and systematic financial manipulation. Her face went pale as I shared bank records showing transfers to accounts in her name. This is ridiculous, she interrupted, but her voice cracked slightly. Thomas was sick, paranoid. These documents could have been altered by anyone. Including by you, I asked, pulling out the security footage screenshots. Because Thomas also documented you searching through his desk, photographing financial statements, and having conversations about handling the Eleanor problem. The room went silent, except for the soft clink of water glasses and nervous coughs. Sandra's social circle was watching their polished friend's reputation crumble in real time. Detective Chen stood up, introducing herself and her credentials before explaining the scope of the investigation. Thomas had initiated. Mr. Brennan presented additional evidence of forged documents and unauthorized financial transactions. Patricia Morrison confirmed that Sandra had asked inappropriate questions about our business accounts months before Thomas died. But Sandra's final mistake was trying to maintain her victim narrative even as the evidence mounted against her. This is a conspiracy, she screamed, losing all pretense of dignity. You're all ganging up on me because you can't accept that an old woman manipulated a sick man. She lunged toward me across the table, knocking over wine glasses and flower arrangements. You pathetic manipulative witch, you destroyed my marriage and stole my children's inheritance. Richard finally moved, not to support his wife, but to pull her away from me. The physical aggression in front of 20 witnesses was the final nail in her legal coffin. Detective Chen stepped forward with handcuffs as club security arrived. Sandra's screaming accusations echoed through the dining room as she was escorted out, her carefully constructed social reputation in ruins. I sat quietly in my chair, watching my son realize that his wife had been lying to him about everything for years. The woman he'd chosen over his parents was being arrested for stealing from his dying father. But it was too late for apologies or reconciliation. Some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness, and some choices can't be undone. I walked out of that country club alone, leaving behind 20 years of fake family celebrations and forced pleasantries. For the first time in years, I felt completely free. The story spread through our small town like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Sandra's arrest made the local newspaper, complete with details about the financial fraud investigation and the sophisticated manipulation scheme she'd been operating for years. Other victims came forward almost immediately. The Morrison family discovered that Sandra had convinced their elderly father to co-sign a loan she never intended to repay. The Hendricks found evidence that she'd been researching their property values and asking neighbors about their health problems. 3 different families reported suspicious conversations where Sandra had asked detailed questions about inheritance plans and financial arrangements. Detective Chen coordinated with other law enforcement agencies as the scope of Sandra's activities became clear. She hadn't just targeted my family. She'd been running similar schemes throughout the region, identifying vulnerable elderly couples and positioning herself to exploit their trust and resources. She had a system, Detective Chen explained during one of our follow-up meetings. She'd research families with substantial assets and aging parents, then find ways to infiltrate their social circles. Your case was just the most successful because she managed to marry into the target family. Richard lost his job within a week of Sandra's arrest. The scandal made him unemployable in our tight-knit business community, where reputation and trust were essential currencies. He'd been part of Sandra's scheme, even if he claimed ignorance of the full extent of her activities. He tried calling me several times, leaving voicemails that ranged from angry accusations to tearful apologies. I listened to each message once, then deleted them. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt with words. The civil recovery process moved slowly through the courts, but Detective Chen was optimistic about reclaiming most of the stolen money. Sandra's assets, the designer clothes, expensive jewelry, and luxury car payments were all traceable to funds she'd taken from our accounts. The ironic thing, Detective Chen noted, is that if she'd simply waited for natural inheritance, she probably would have received a substantial amount anyway. Her greed and impatience destroyed everything she was trying to secure. But the money wasn't really the point anymore. Thomas's final gift hadn't been financial security. It had been the truth about who my family really was, and the tools to protect myself from further exploitation. I began the process of selling our house, not because I couldn't maintain it, but because every room held memories of Sandra's manipulation and Richard's betrayal. The kitchen where she'd critiqued my cooking while planning to sell my home. The living room where she'd cataloged my possessions like inventory. The dining room where she'd suggested I was becoming too confused to manage my own affairs. My sister Ruth flew in from Arizona to help with the packing and sorting. We worked together in comfortable silence, wrapping dishes that had served Sunday dinners to people who'd been planning to steal them. "You know," Ruth said, carefully folding one of my quilts, "Thomas was always the smartest one in the family. Even dying, he was still protecting you." I found his final letter to me, tucked inside his desk drawer, sealed with instructions to open only after Sandra's trial was complete. The envelope was thick, containing not just words but photographs from our early marriage, ticket stubs from dates we'd taken, pressed flowers from bouquets he'd given me over the years. His letter was simple and heartbreaking. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, then justice has been served, and you're free to grieve me properly. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this pain, but I hope I've given you the tools to protect yourself. Build a new life, surrounded by people who love you for who you are, not what you can provide them. You deserve better than we gave you these last few years." I cried reading those words, not from sadness, but from relief. My husband had seen everything, understood everything, and loved me enough to fight back even from his deathbed. 3 months after Sandra's arrest, I hosted a small dinner party in my new apartment. Ruth, Patricia Morrison, Detective Chen, and 2 neighbors from my new building joined me for homemade lasagna and honest conversation. No one critiqued my cooking or suggested I was too old to manage complicated tasks. No one calculated the value of my belongings or suggested I needed supervision. We just shared a meal and genuine friendship. The way family should work. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. 6 months after Sandra's arrest, I hosted Christmas dinner in my new home, a cozy apartment near my sister Ruth's place in Tucson. The Arizona sunshine streamed through windows that framed desert mountains instead of the snowy Ohio landscape I'd known for 70 years. Ruth had helped me choose everything carefully. Furniture that fit my needs rather than impressing visitors. Artwork that made me smile instead of covering wall space. Dishes that were beautiful, but not precious. This was a home designed for living, not for inventory, by greedy relatives. My guests arrived throughout the afternoon. Ruth and her husband Bob, Patricia Morrison, who'd driven down from Flagstaff, Detective Chen, who'd become an unexpected friend, and 3 neighbors from my apartment complex, who'd become chosen family. The conversation flowed easily around my table, punctuated by genuine laughter and comfortable silences. No one watched the clock or made excuses about other obligations. No one critiqued my menu choices or suggested improvements to my decorating style. No one calculated the value of anything in my home. This was what family dinners should feel like. Richard had written me a letter from prison, where he was serving 18 months for his role in the financial fraud. The letter was full of apologies and explanations, blame for Sandra, and requests for forgiveness. He wanted me to visit, to rebuild our relationship, to help him start over when he was released. I read the letter once, then filed it away unanswered. Some relationships can't survive betrayal, even between mothers and sons. Some choices leave permanent scars that all the apologies in the world can't heal. That didn't make me cruel. It made me realistic about protecting my peace. Sandra had been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to elder fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy charges. The civil court had ordered her to repay nearly $300,000 when other victims' losses were calculated, money she didn't have and couldn't earn from prison. But justice wasn't really about the money or the prison sentences. Justice was about the peace I felt sitting at my own table, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide them. Detective Chen raised her wine glass as the sun set over the Sonoran Desert, to Eleanor, who proved that it's never too late to fight back and never too early to start over. I lifted my glass, thinking about Thomas and the final gift he'd given me, not just financial security, but the knowledge that I was stronger than anyone had given me credit for, including myself. To second chances, I said quietly, and the wisdom to know who deserves them. Ruth squeezed my hand across the table, and to families we choose instead of families we're stuck with. We toasted to new beginnings and authentic relationships, to sunset dinners that ended when we wanted them to end, to conversations that nourished instead of manipulated. Later that evening, after my guests had gone home and I was washing dishes in my small kitchen, I realized something profound. I was completely happy. Not the performance of happiness I'd maintained during those strained family dinners, but genuine contentment with my life and my choices. Thomas would have been proud of the woman I'd become in his absence. Not the confused, helpless widow Sandra had tried to create, but the strong, independent woman he'd always known I could be. I raised a final toast to his memory, then turned off the lights and went to bed in my own home, surrounded by my own choices, accountable to no one but myself. For the first time in years, I slept without worrying about tomorrow's manipulation or next week's family drama. I slept like a woman who'd finally reclaimed her own life. 1 year after that life-changing afternoon in Mr. Brennan's office, I'm sitting in my garden in Tucson, watching hummingbirds visit the feeder I hung outside my kitchen window. The desert morning is clear and warm, full of possibilities I never could have imagined when I was trapped in that old life of fake smiles and financial theft. My story isn't really about revenge, though that's how it might sound to people who've never lived through systematic betrayal by the people closest to them. It's about the difference between justice and vengeance, between protecting yourself and destroying others, between reclaiming your dignity and losing your soul. Thomas understood this distinction when he planned his final gift to me. He didn't want Sandra and Richard destroyed, he wanted me empowered. He didn't seek their suffering, he sought my freedom. His carefully documented evidence wasn't meant to hurt them, but to help me see clearly who they really were and what they were really doing. The truth is, sometimes the most devastating weapon of all, but it's also the cleanest one. It cuts through lies and manipulation without requiring you to become manipulative yourself. It exposes predators without making you predatory. It delivers justice without demanding your humanity as payment. I learned lessons in that year that I wish I'd understood decades earlier. I learned that keeping peace isn't worth sacrificing truth. That family loyalty shouldn't require accepting abuse. That love without respect is just emotional manipulation, wearing a prettier mask. I learned that it's never too late to stand up for yourself with dignity, never too early to recognize manipulation, and never wrong to choose your own peace over other people's comfort. My new life here in Arizona is simpler but richer than anything I had before. I volunteer at a senior center, helping other elderly people recognize signs of financial abuse and family manipulation. I've helped 3 families uncover theft by adult children, 2 women escape controlling relationships, and 1 grandfather protect his assets from a predatory caregiver. Thomas's insurance money funded a small foundation that provides legal assistance to elderly victims of family financial abuse. We've helped recover over $500,000 in stolen assets and prevented countless additional thefts by educating seniors about common manipulation tactics. But the most important thing I've built is a life surrounded by authentic relationships, people who value my friendship rather than my resources, who enjoy my company rather than calculating my net worth, who support my choices rather than trying to control my decisions. Ruth and I take morning walks through the desert, talking about books we're reading and places we want to visit. Patricia Morrison comes down from Flagstaff every few months, and we explore art galleries and farmers markets, like teenagers discovering freedom. Detective Chen and I correspond regularly, sharing updates about cases and celebrating victories for other families who've escaped similar situations. Richard continues writing letters that I continue filing away unread. Sandra was released early for good behavior, but immediately violated her parole by attempting to contact other elderly victims. She's back in prison now, her schemes finally catching up with her completely. I feel no satisfaction in their downfall, no pleasure in their suffering. What I feel is relief, the deep, peaceful relief of a woman who no longer has to pretend that wolves are sheep, that theft is love, that manipulation is family devotion. As I water the memorial rose bush I planted for Thomas, I think about the gift he gave me in those final months. Not just the money or the house or the legal protection, but the knowledge that I was worth protecting, that my life had value beyond what I could provide other people, that my happiness mattered as much as anyone else's comfort. If my story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear that they're not alone in their struggle against family manipulation. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because every week I share stories of ordinary people finding extraordinary courage in impossible situations. In the comments below, tell me, have you ever had to choose between family peace and your own dignity? Your stories remind me that we're all stronger than we know, and that sharing our truth helps others find theirs. Until next time, remember, it's never too late to reclaim your voice, and it's never wrong to use it to protect yourself and others from those who would steal, not just your money, but your very sense of self.